Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Inua Advocacy October Zoom conversation, where we will be discussing with an expert about the issues affecting refugees, especially focusing on the funding gap. Many of you have heard that United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, has had to close its doors almost completely because they left 2 staff members in Malawi and 1 driver to keep the office going, and everyone else has been sent home. Now, this is not just an issue that is affecting refugees. It's a global trend that is threatening humanitarian services and development as well. Now, we can rely on what we hear on the media, but we thought it would be really, really wise to dig deep and understand, how does this issue go? What are the likelihood of us seeing back the thriving donor community coming back and inputting and changing lives? Now, in terms of refugees, and for the sake of this conversation, we also look at how does donors look at people, community-based organizations like Inua Advocacy, that are led by people from the community who understand deep down what is happening in the community. And when we look at the global trend in terms of funding, over 80% of donor funding is managed by international organizations. And local organizations in the grassroots are fighting between 1% to 2%. Now, with the burden of many donors pulling out, what does that situation look like on the ground? And also we'll be looking at, how does donor community look or view organizations like Inua, that they don't provide funding for food, etc., but their role, or our role, is to tackle the core matter that most of the time are at the root of poverty, the legal discrimination or legal aspect in terms of refugees, that refugees are not allowed to legally work, and therefore they need support on a monthly basis. So today the conversation will be interactive. So my guest is an educator, is a global changer, is really someone very important. And when I had a conversation with her, I was like, no, we need to give her space, and we need people to really listen to her. So I'll let her introduce herself. Anaïs, welcome, and please introduce yourself, and then we'll dive into our conversation.
Hi, I'm Anaïs. I'm a humanitarian professional. I've been in the sector for over 20 years. I've spent about half of this working for international NGOs in Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East. And the other half has been spent advising governments on humanitarian issues. I also lecture and teach master students who want to get involved in humanitarian and development work. I'm very passionate about it, and I'm a very big advocate of a fairer system, especially one that puts grassroots organizations and affected populations a lot more at the center of what is going on.
Thank you. I mean, when we talk about funding in the humanitarian sector, many of us were shocked when we saw or we heard that USAID, had pulled out when Donald Trump, the president of the United States, stopped the funding that USAID has been providing over the years across the globe. And that was a shock. Many nations did not know how to act or react. And many humanitarian organizations were really, really, affected, and most of them are affected. Businesses are affected because I never knew, even being in the sector, that USAID was the lead in the humanitarian sector globally in terms of funding. And so we only saw that, and we see now the effect, as we said in the introduction, that UNHCR has had to pull out in Malawi, and many other countries are likely to follow. Not only UNHCR, but we also see other organizations that were being funded by USAID really stopping providing their support. Now, as an expert, is this just the US pulling out the funding, or there is more to that in terms of politics and, economy? What do you have? What is it?
It's an excellent question, and I think I'm probably not going to give the answer that your members want to hear, but I think what we're looking at is here to stay. I don't think that was a one-off, and I don't think it's going to be reversed. So I'm going to explain that. First is that you had USAID being closed and all of the US funding effectively ceasing, but you've also had a lot of the other Western donors cutting down their overseas development assistance by 30, 40, 50%. Look at Netherlands, Germany, France. So there is a trend in all of the Western donors to cut down or stop entirely, in the case of the US, obviously development assistance. And I think the drivers of these decisions are here to stay, which is why I would argue that there isn't going to be a reversal of that trend anytime soon. And those drivers to me are threefold. One is the pressure that a lot of the Western governments are under from an extremely populist, immigrant loathing, right-wing ideology that is in power in the US, for example, but is at the doors of power in a lot of Western countries. Take France, take the UK, is in power in Italy. And this agenda fuels anti-migrant, anti-refugee sentiment, and is centered around the idea that we should favor our own people. And that means cutting down on generosity for overseas development assistance for two reasons. One is that priority should be given to our people. And I'll come back to what that really means, because essentially it's a very racist agenda. Our people doesn't mean our citizens, it means our white citizens. It's an important distinction that is never really set out as explicitly. And so the idea is that resources should be geared towards them in priority. And the nation is the primary entity around which everything evolves, which means international matters are only relevant if they represent a strategic interest for the nation. If it's just charity, that doesn't fit into this kind of ideology. So that's the first trend. And I think it's been on a rise for 20 years. It's in power in some countries now, near the doors of power in others. This is going to stay. The second, that is more specific to Europe, however, is pertaining to a global trend, is the rise of the security spending that European nations believe is necessary to face the Russian threat. In the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, the security threat has perceived to get bigger, to be getting bigger. Right now, you have, I don't know if you've probably seen the news, drone attacks in several European nations on the border with Russia. It is believed that European nations need to increase their defense spending in order to prepare for a potential confrontation with Russia on their territory, or even for a global confrontation with other powers such as China, potentially by proxy. But anyway, China is a bit of a further threat for Europe. But there is this idea that we are in an era of geopolitical tensions that will culminate at one point or another in more wars, and Europe needs to be ready. And that means increasing defense spending. And the third one is the economy. So the economy in the West is not necessarily in a good situation. Again, I'll come back to this if you want any more details. It's not just a reality, it's also a political choice that is being made. But the idea is that with the debt that's exploding, with the economic growth that's pretty slow, pretty small, bit bigger in the US, but in the West it's kind of 1%. You're not getting enough resources to keep up with all of the different allocations that you used to do at the government, and some things have to give, and one of them is obviously development assistance. And so I think, I think the right-wing movement and their pressure is not going away. The security environment and geopolitical tensions are not going to improve. The economy is not getting better anytime soon. So I think what we're seeing is a level of overseas development assistance that's been cut, that is going to stay at this level. And I don't think it's going to come back to what it was. And this is something that I'm hearing all from colleagues in other governments. No one is really seeing it that way, but I believe that's more than just a short-term change. I think it's a new landscape that's here to stay.
Wow, that's quite concerning and scary, because if it were just like one person, the US president, one would say once he gets out of power, things will change, but they may not change and go back to where they used to be, which is a threat to doing good in the world. And I mean, what you say about the right wing, it's something that I never looked at, because I didn't have time to really dig into it. But now that it threatens the humanitarian, the support that poor people rely on, I think it's important to really get to understanding it
Yeah.
most
And I
broadly.
think, I mean, so if you take the case of the US, the reasons that were given to close US aid were very explicitly ideological. They were very clearly about this agenda.
Mm.
And but that's not necessarily the case everywhere. If you look at Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, when he announced there would be a reduction in overseas development assistance, the first thing that he said is it's not an ideological decision.
Yeah.
That it's not about ideology, it's about we need to find money for security and defense. We don't have infinite resources. So I'm going to cut development so that I can increase defense. That was his reasoning. And that was his line when he announced it. So you can have different reasons why the cuts are being justified, and they can be more or less openly done in the name of this ideology. But the thing is, that makes overseas development assistance almost an issue of democracy in the West, because what overseas development assistance is, even though we can always criticize its neocolonial tendencies and a lot of the entrenched and embedded domination and power dynamics, of course, it is to some extent about humanist values, and it will be defended and is being defended by governments that make those values a cornerstone of their agenda. So, and it has popular support. I mean, to some extent, the people support humanitarian aid. They might have a very partial idea of what it is and exactly what it does. But if you look at a lot of surveys in the West, the idea that there is limited support for humanitarian aid, which is what a lot of these right-wing politicians say, is actually untrue. There is popular support for it. the idea of a lack of support is largely a media fabrication and a political fabrication to justify their agenda. And it uses arguments around the lack of effectiveness, around corruption, but really it is around this ideology of national resources have to be geared towards national issues, and they have to be geared towards our people. And when you hear about our people, essentially it's a very deeply racist agenda, because first and foremost it means white people that are supposed to be originating only from those countries. And this rise of the far right, it's not out of the blue. So it probably is something that you haven't seen because you don't live in Europe, but I've been watching it, and it has been gaining importance over the last 20 years. And it's helped by economic difficulties, social inequalities, the control of the media and of tech, in part by very powerful right-wing supporters. And all of this together is putting the government under a massive amount of pressure. And basically, what that does, this pressure, is you have a choice. Either you lean into the right wing agenda and you start making immigration the issue or a key issue. That's what the Labour government in the UK currently is doing. And that gives credence and credibility to the claim that there is a migration crisis, which is, in fact, is not true. Or you decisively uphold a very different agenda that looks at class inequalities as the core reason why the situation is what it is and doesn't scapegoat immigrants. And obviously, development assistance is the same. You either uphold it as this set of humanist values, or you drop it under that pressure. And I think the governments have been wrestling with it, and then they were tipped over in the last couple of years by the economy, which got worse, and by security. It's a combination of those. It's not just the right wing pressure. It met, right, the pressure of these different things. They all converged, and that led to those decisions being made.
Yes, but I mean, still on the right wing, when the money is that was meant for development and support outside of the country, when that money is no longer going, let's say the US or the UK, have you seen any change in terms of how those countries take care of their own poor people or services?
Absolutely not. And this is where the lie is. This is where you see it's a fabrication. First, I think what's important to say is that the United Nations set an objective back in the 1970s that every country in the West should spend 0.7% of its gross domestic product on overseas development assistance. This target has never been met, except by Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, I think Finland, Norway, Sweden for sure, and Turkey sometimes.
Oh, wow.
Every other Western donor has never met this target. So in fact, they're not cutting much. They're cutting 0.3, 0.4, sometimes less, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the grand scheme of things, it's a very minor economy. And it's a very wrong type of reasoning, because the value that you're going to get out of it is much less than the negative impact it's going to have, right? The trade-off is clearly a negative. And that's where you see the huge gap between what's being said and the actual reality. Look at the US that you mentioned. The US was 40% of development and humanitarian funding.
Yeah.
But in share of their GDP, it was 0.3, maximum 0.4%. The only reason why they were so big is because they have a big economy.
Yeah.
But they weren't allocating that much to overseas development assistance. They didn't need to. If they just gave 0.3, they were already the first, and by far, right? The next ones were maybe 10%. So they were huge by, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 times more than the other donors. And so I think they, going back to the right wing thing, the economy is almost false in a sense, because it's extremely small. Now, it's too early to say whether, even though it's small, will it or will it not be allocated to social protection measures. But I don't think it will be, because you see at the same time then obviously development assistance is being cut. If I take France as my country, for example, we're also looking at an austerity budget for next year, where a lot of the social measures are being cut down because of the debt that's very high, because of the growth that's slow. And so we're being told we need to find economies, and they're being found in different places. And that's not just order, that's also social budgets. Also, climate change is not being addressed as much at all. France is going backwards on a lot of its commitments around the environment, climate change adaptation. It's not financing it. So no, it is a lie. And it's not, it's again, it's a narrative, it's a discourse, right? It's part of this ideology where the story you create, the values you propagate, and the cohesion, unity that you create out of it, that feeds into your aspiration for power or maintain you in power, matter a lot more than the facts.
Yeah, I mean, we see globally that the inequality in economic growth is growing day by day. And you said it right, that countries are now investing more into their defense rather than in the social causes. How deep is this likely to go? And how does it influence in the now and the long run the culture of charity and humanitarian assistance?
So I'm probably not going to try to predict the future, because that's difficult. But I think the next 10 to 15 years are going to be really tough. I think the different forces that we talked about the different drivers are gonna be here to stay. And I think the only thing that is going to potentially offer a renewed perspective for organizations like yours in Malawi, and for organizations that are in the humanitarian sector, is a change in the kind of political agendas that are being defended in the West. Because if you look at the economic situation, you have economic growth that is slow, you have inflation that's a key concern, you have a public debt that is high. And so that's creating a lot of economic and fiscal pressures. And in turn, governments are saying, well, because of that, then we need to do savings. And that should be done on obviously development. That has to be taken from climate adaptation programs or environmental programs, the expansion of social protection measures, so on and so forth. But in fact, if they decided, say, those governments, to tax the wealthiest in a lot more systematic way and in greater proportions, they could rack up a lot more resources quite immediately. If you look at, again, I take the example of France, you have a pressure that's about maybe 40 billion. You could earn half that by taxing the wealthiest of the country at 2%, and you would rack up half of what you need already to kind of bridge the gap. So this is a question of choice, of political choice. What's presented to us as an economic necessity.
But anyway,
is a
I
result
hope you don't mind if I interrupt, because you talked about taxing the wealthiest.
Yeah.
I mean, is it like, for people who don't have really an idea of how taxes work, especially like in France or in the West, when they hear taxing the wealthiest, is it like punishing them for having so much money, or is letting them pay?
Sorry,
Like, how can
yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. all I'm saying is, if we look at what the so we've looked at a pretty gloomy picture and the reasons why we're likely to, in the next 10 to 15 years, be faced with more of the same, essentially,
Yeah,
right? Now, if we look at what can give us hope and what can change the game, all I was trying to say is that there are a few things, okay? One of them is a change in fiscal policies in the West, whereby they can collect more resources from the wealthiest of their nation, and that means they don't need to cut where they're currently cutting.
correct.
And those new fiscal policies are not punishing or harming the wealthy. They are literally just asking them to contribute to the extent of what they've earned at the same level than others do. So I
Okay,
won't go into the details, but they're not harmful for the economy, despite what's being said.
that's great.
And I think the other thing is that countries like Malawi, organizations like grassroots organizations such as yours and others, are going to have to create new models and new partnerships. And it's brutal. The way you're being asked to do it is very brutal because it's very sudden. But maybe that's going to be an opportunity to craft things that are going to be a little bit more durable. And what I mean by this is that you've got some of the action, some of the humanitarian and development work, in part, that philanthropy and charitable organizations are still going to pick up. And often those philanthropy and organizations are a lot more amicable to grassroots and local organizations than traditional institutional donors, right? Because their
Yeah,
systems are a lot more flexible, they're more agile, they're more small scale. The private sector is still going to be investing in the global south to a different extent. And they are going to feel the pressure of a part of society that wants more equitable, sorry, a part of society that's very keen on the environment, very keen on social justice, very keen on racial justice, very keen on gender justice. So whether they're doing it for public relation purpose or because they believe in it, a lot of private companies are going to want to be seen to be doing better and more for the countries where they invest or the countries where they work. So they're going to have some corporate social responsibilities. So here too, there's something you can try to exploit. Climate funding is a whole stream that's going to stay. It is not funded to the extent that it should be funded, but it is still funded, and I think it will stay. Now, there are some examples in the Philippines of women-based grassroots organizations that have gotten involved in the climate agenda, trying to show the disproportionate impact of climate change on women, and they've harnessed that to create a new stream of revenue. So I think it's about relying less on the institutional donors and traditional actors like the UN, and turning to those other actors that often are already there, but that we as a sector, we haven't involved as much. And I think that's probably something that gives a little bit of hope. It's not going to be easy because those actors come with their own demand. So,
yeah,
UNHCR ask you for all sorts of things to be met, right? You've got due diligence requirements, reporting requirements, the budget can finance this, not that, etc. Any other donor will have conditions to, requirements to, so it's not necessarily going to be an easy one, and you're going to have to choose whether you can meet those demands or not. But what I'm saying is, you have those other actors that you can try to tap into. And I think one of the key to unlocking those different new streams is two things. One is really dedicating time and energy to thinking about your new economic model.
Yeah.
You need to brainstorm, you need to try to create something. And the second is, I can see already that the decrease in funding is aggravating competition in the sector. So instead of trying to, on paper, it's about collaboration and coordination. In reality, there's a lot of competition, and it's almost like, well, if there's,
Absolutely.
if there's less funding, I'm going to try to get it for my organization. I ain't going to try to get it for. But I think that's actually probably a mistake. I understand why it's happening, but I think especially for grassroots, local, national actors, I think now is the time more than ever to come together and try to work on economies of scale.
Yeah.
Try to have a consolidated offer, platform, consortium, alliance, whatever form, network, whatever form suits you. And you offer that. And if you offer that, a donor might be, okay, that's interesting. They're covering half the country, or maybe they do advocacy and services. It will offer something. One of the reasons why a lot of the Western governments were funding the United Nations, part of it is because the United Nations Specialized Agency had a mandate, which they and only they had, such as
Yeah.
UNHCR, working on refugees. But part of it also was that they can work at scale. They have very strong due diligence requirement, and they have a donor culture. So they're really good at crafting proposals, reporting back, having the right systems in place, telling the story that you want to hear, managing risks. Okay. So whether you like it or not, this were some of the reasons. So you need to be kind of beating them at the game, right? So have those as areas of work. And I think this could be something where you see the difference. And I think, localization is going to, if anything, localization is going to be considered cheaper in a world with less resources. So it will be something that could gain traction because of that.
Yeah. I mean, wow.
But
So
it's
basically,
something, sorry, go ahead.
you don't have good news for countries like Malawi or institutions that has been relying on donors, but what you're offering is the truth that is not diluted, but at the same time you're saying like this is the time to to look at other streams of funding that can support in the long run. But like what you said about climate funding, I did not know that it exists, and already some examples in the Philippines of organizations that are tapping into that. Yes, you have said that it's not big to replace what has been, but it's significant. But also you talked about I like what you said about consortiums and people working together. I laugh because given your experience in the humanitarian, exactly that we talk about collaboration, we talk about ABCD, but there's a lot of competition that is not necessary, and even animosity, and especially for small organizations like ours, like you can be taken out of the game if you are threatening a competition of big organizations that feel like they are mandated, they are the eligible ones, and you do not have what you said that UNHCR has. They have risk assessments and they are built to do what they're supposed to do. And so people like us who are driven by passion, you are seen as a threat. But the hope that you are giving us is, can you brainstorm? Can you find other ways of doing things? Can you be, in coalition so that you can maximize what is there? But also, my mind is just spinning and thinking, what else can we do? But I believe just like COVID brought a lot of opportunities, I believe this is a threat that we need to take and think through and find opportunities that it might bring, although it's scary, although it's a bit disappointing sometimes. But I think if we put into thinking a lot and planning, I think we can get through it.
Yeah, and I think I mean I would like to be the bearer of better news, but I think I'm a person who believes that it is better to be realistic and kind of hope for the best but plan for the worst in a way.
Yeah.
It's kind of a humanitarian model. I also think that when you take localization, which is essentially what we would want to progress, localization is challenging the system because it is questioning the very interests of the bigger players in the system,
Mm.
which is why it's not progressing. It's only progressing in different areas of the world under the leadership of local organizations that just have had enough and have gotten together and have done something. And I think that's the way forward. And in terms of inspiration, I would say look at the START network, look at Asia. Myanmar has a lot of localization. Bangladesh, also Syria, northwest Syria actually has had a lot of localization initiative. Look at the Share Trust closer to you guys in East Africa. The Share Trust based in Uganda, I think, is working a lot on that. And in the same way that you're faced with a very brutal and honest truth in the landscape you're in now, you're going to have a bit of an honest conversation amongst yourselves as local national actors. And as you say, I think it's important to recognize that there might be animosity, which is very understandable. I mean, it's people's livelihoods, it's people's futures, it's all of that, it's belief. But you're gonna have to look at what is the source of animosity, but also what is the reason why you're doing all of this, and what is it that bring you together, and what is it that you bring to the table that none of these other actors bring to the table. And that is where your strength is. And if you took a kind of economic reasoning, that's where your comparative advantage is.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to sharpen that. That would be one of the things I would emphasize.
Wow. Thank you so much. I mean, I don't want really to take much of your time because I mean I've benefited a lot from the conversation, just understanding that what the world is dealing with is not just one thing, could be three, could be four, and it's not here just to go by, maybe here to stay. But if we really want to continue doing good, if you really want to continue thriving, we need to do things differently with understanding of the difficulties of the current, or how funding has been trickling, and especially on us as local aid organizations that have been vulnerable all these years. Like the vulnerability just aggravates. But I think if we take your model of working together.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to say one last thing is don't let the system, and I think maybe I've done a bit of that with what I said, so I just want to make sure I nuance it. We shouldn't let the current situation translate into an increased burden on local organizations. Right? We shouldn't let this crisis, to call it this way quickly, become just another reason for local organizations to be bearing the burden of what's going on. So I think you, especially if you're an advocacy organization like you are, you need to hold those that have power accountable still. So it needs to be a deal. It needs to be, we will be looking at efficiencies, collaboration, new models, but you need to live up to your end of the bargain.
Yeah.
If you're the Malawi state, you need to make reforms that mean that you can absorb refugees into your different systems, whether that's economy, health, education. If you're an institutional donor, you cannot just drop Malawi. You're gonna have to continue addressing this and that. You see what I mean?
Yeah,
Because I think
totally.
otherwise the narrative is going to become, well, too bad, just come up with your new model. It's all down to you now. Let's
Yeah.
not We need to be really careful. We need to continue. I continue saying to my government, of course, I can think of a new project with half the money. I can do that. I can think
Yeah.
about that with my partner. But really, I want all the money I had originally asked for because this is what we need.
Yeah.
You need to continue fighting on both fronts, is all I'm
Yeah.
to say.
No, thank you so much. That is quite, that's actually hopeful, because you can just decide to drop the ball because, you are kind of suffocating. But,
Mm.
I like that word of wisdom that brings resilience. And I mean, I fired so many questions to you. Before we finish, do you have any question for me?
Well, I was just wondering, in Malawi, in the context that you're looking at, um, what have you seen? Have you seen? I'm sure I mean, you've seen the morale being hit, and the shock coming in, and the very real impact on refugee assistance, on services, all of that. Is that all you're seeing, or are you seeing some sort of change in the system and in the way of operating? Are you seeing some of this discussion that we've had trickling down, or are we still in Malawi kind of dealing with a shock?
Yeah, I mean, I think for now we are still in the shock
Mm,
mode. We haven't seen any big pivot to finding solutions, accepting that this is where we are and this we might be here.
mm,
Now, how can we, move forward past the situation? So I believe that's what we are, the stage we are still in. Like an hour ago, I spoke to someone in Zadeka, in the refugee camp, who has been really giving his talent and expertise in training local organizations. And he says, the morale is really down because the fact that UNHCR has pulled out, and many of its partners that it used to give funding to have also have to pull out. The refugees organizations, yes, they are passionate, but their funding is really what it is, very, very small, because of the level of trust that donors have for them. But also you have now the situation in Malawi, where the laws in Malawi have not yet accepted refugees to be able to use their skills outside of the refugee camp. And so it's really a tough situation. But I believe this is a message that now we need to take to them, to say, hey, this is not just one single aspect. Look at it in terms of politics. Look at it in terms of economy and how the right wing is rising in Europe and in the US, and how those ideology are affecting and will continue to affect humanitarian and development sectors. And so there is need to, to change our mindset if really we are going into to thrive in this. And so really start knocking. Like I was just thinking, we can start, knocking at different organizations, business people in Malawi, for corporate social responsibility. It's a sector that not very many organizations have, or charitable organizations or development organizations have tapped into, or maybe because there haven't been this culture of giving. When I see the West, compare the West and us in Africa, in the West you have more organizations that give money, and in Africa we have more organizations that need money, and unfortunately, some of them are genuine. They are, when I say genuine, they are driven by passion to make a lasting change. And those I call not genuine, they are set up as a way of creating employment. And so usually checks and balances are not there. And those two groups, they work differently. And so you can be a genuine organization driven by passion to make lasting change, but you may lack in some skills that attract the donor. You don't speak the language of a donor. And so those who are clever, although their motives are not in the right place, the moment they know how to speak the donor language, they have access to all the funding. And so that's quite the problem that I see every day. But I think we can do better. And you know, organization like ours, Inua Advocacy, where to get to where you can show impact, it takes time. It's not like someone was wearing rags and now you buy new clothes, you dress them, you can take a picture before and after and show a donor the impact. Our impact turns to take time. And so although we are very good at communicating, those levels of impact, even in the small way, because the greatest impact that we want is when Malawi changes the law to allow refugees to use their skills.
Yeah.
The kids who were born in Malawi 31 years ago to be accepted, not only as Malawian, even if they are not taken as Malawian, just being given the freedom of movement and be allowed to settle, be allowed to start businesses or apply for jobs. People have been there for many years, accepted to integrate. That is the ultimate, impact that you're looking for. It may take 2, 3, 5 years. We don't know. And so to attract funders, it's not easy. And so I've been thinking that what if we start providing, some levels of consultancies that generate an income that we can use to substantiate the small income that we are getting? What if, because I've also been checking the Malawi stock market. The Malawi stock market has been really, really growing and actually doing really well in terms of, in terms of growth. And so I was thinking, what if, there was, $100 that we can put in there and, see it grow, in the next 4 or 5 years. And so those are some of the thoughts that I was thinking when you were talking, and I think I'll explore them more. And I believe this conversation is to go and inspire others.
Great. Excellent. And I'm happy if that's the case. And I'm always open for another chat. I think you are at the intersection of a lot of the current issues right now. So refugees are and refugee organizations are really one of the epicenters of all of those different trends kind of culminating into hardship. So I kind of really admire and have a lot of respect for the dedication and the thinking. So if there's any appetite for another conversation anytime soon, let me know. And I will always be happy to help.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate once again for your time, expertise, and I believe we'll keep in touch.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.